Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Now and Men, the podcast about men, masculinities, and gender equality. It's Stephen Burrell here, and I'm actually broadcasting from Brisbane, down under currently, but I'm together as usual with my co-host, Sandy Ruxton. Hi, Sandy.
Good day, Stephen. I'm more than a little jealous at your location there. No doubt you're spending most of your days working hard rather than chilling in your bathers, but I hope so anyway. We're here with Dan Guinness, who's the co-founder and managing director of the UK charity Beyond Equality, which works with men and boys to promote gender equality, inclusive communities and healthier relationships. And Beyond Equality runs transformative workshops and has done so with over 60,000 people now, I think, in schools, universities and workplaces across the UK. And Dan's got an academic background. He holds a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Oxford University, and he's also a former professional rugby player. So welcome, Dan, to the programme.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm similarly jealous of the bathers and swimming at beach time. Yeah, but
I did actually go for a swim just before this. Yeah.
Good. I encourage you to do more of that and less work while you've got the opportunity.
But we'll also talk shortly about the work you do with Beyond Equality. But as you may well know, like on Now and Men, we do also like to explore the kind of personal side of this work. So perhaps we could start off by actually asking you, I suppose, how did you first start thinking about issues of kind of masculinity and gender equality? Like, how did those first come into your life, and what led you to then start actually wanting to work on these issues as well?
Yeah, I think the start for me, there's like this trajectory that I go on, and I think it's a trajectory that quite a few people go on, which is that initially it was kind of like this issue that I saw that didn't really have anything to do with me, like a problem that the bad people over there were bristling up, and why there's this conversation about it. And then maybe it became a little bit theoretical, like, yeah, it's an issue, but still not one that I've really got my feet into, that I would talk about in various places, and finally actually becoming personal. But the starting point for me came from my mum, and it came particularly strongly in a moment when my parents divorced. And one of the places that she found a lot of meaning and purpose and a lot of other things in her life was by doing kind of these big social projects, community projects, social justice projects. And so she got heavily into feminism, and she got also heavily into migrant support and some Indigenous rights issues in Australia and things like this. And she dragged me along through those things, as mums are wont to do. Kind of leverage a free dinner if you turn up to this event with me, type of a thing. And so I went to some of the white ribbon events in Australia, had some training. I remember this guy rocked up, and I thought he was kind of cool, and I didn't understand why he was talking about these things that's not what those sort of people talk about. Like, that kind of struck me, and I was like, okay, this is interesting. But that's when it was very theoretical. I was there because mum made me, and I could see the concepts, but I felt like those concepts didn't really hit and stick with me. Like, okay, men don't need to be involved in, should be outspoken against violence. And I was like, yeah, of course, right? Like, there's not really a problem there, is there? And then I went overseas, and I can remember it was during this period when I was in Italy, and then when I was in the UK. And in both those periods, I had several moments where the worst parts of violent masculinities and men's entitlement and sexual violence entered into my world, particularly, entered into the lives of women that I was friends with. And that for me was really hard to deal with. I was very grateful that I had a little bit of training at that point in how to like listen to a survivor and support somebody. And I think that meant that I did better than what I would have done otherwise, but still I was just like way out of my depth, because I hadn't realized that these sorts of things could enter into the lives of women that I knew. And since then, I've realized that actually they were there the whole time, and just I had been completely oblivious to it. That had been normalized or hidden or excused or whatever else. And then so that made these issues of sexual violence in particular, but the way that gendered sexual violence, that became more of a personal thing at that point. And then the next step for me really was when that became a my problem. And that happened when I had women in my life calling me out and saying, actually, like, you and that group of people you're with behave like whatever an appropriate word for this podcast is, right? But treat people terribly and are entitled and take up too much space. Or when partners of mine were like, Dan, you talk a good feminism chat, but how are you actually showing up in this relationship? What's going on there? And I think that moment of challenge for me, happened over 5 years, let's say. And there was bits where I really got defensive, pushed back, lots of other things. I found it really difficult. It was a shock to me and a real shock to my sense of who I was and my identity in the community. Like, I think I'd very much branded myself as being one of the nice guys, and along with all of the issues that comes with, of nice guys sort of feeling they're still entitled to things because of that niceness. And yeah, then partly in those moments, I was also going through some tough times personally. I was on the other side of the world. I hit I hit a very abrupt end to my professional rugby career, where I had some pretty major injuries and ended up getting 4 back surgeries and had to get a part of my back removed and replaced with like titanium and all these like screws and bone grafts, and months and months and months of not being able to do things that I used to be able to do, like not being able to go grocery shopping, not being able to walk properly, not being able to lift anything, not being able to get in and out of the shower by myself. I remember one day, I kind of I think my lowest point there was I'd had this tweak of this injury and I thought it was bad, but maybe it wasn't so bad. And I went home and I was in quite a bit of pain, but went to bed and woke up in the night to go to the bathroom, and it was all okay. Limped down, staggered down, got into the bathroom. And then when I went to try to pull up my trousers to go back to bed, I couldn't, and I collapsed on the ground in agony and had to yell out for help for someone to come collect me. And the only person who woke up was the new boyfriend, or not new, but new to me boyfriend of a housemate. And, he kind of walked in and found me half naked and sort of had to, drag me to my feet and help me to bed and things like this. And that moment where I had those personal struggles, I started to see how much of those personal struggles was being made worse by how much I'd attached my sense of my own self-worth to living up to a masculine stereotype of performing that athleticism, of being the big strong guy, of all of that sort of stuff, and of being able to solve all my problems by myself. And then I wasn't asking for help when I needed it, and things like this. So yeah, at that point, in that period, and I say that point, 5 years, I started to try to do initiatives to get other men involved. And it was after some workshops that we'd done with the local rape crisis center, where the feedback from the trainers and the feedback from the group was the material's fantastic, but they're just not actually really engaging with it. They're like, this doesn't relate to me. And so at that point, that was the genesis of my actual involvement in this work, of being like, well, maybe there can just be this like translating type of a role of trying to link or create spaces and create conversations that men aren't having, but they could have. Anyway, and that slowly developed, and 10 years later, we're in Beyond Equality, and we do this, with thousands of people every year, and I think we do it really well a lot of the time. So I'm really, really pleased with where that journey has gotten me and the sort of work that I get to do now.
Wow, such a powerful story, and like touches on so many issues which we deal with in this space. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I mean, so you've obviously mentioned about how you were involved in sport, even in a professional capacity in rugby. So I presume, therefore, you see there being like kind of benefits to engaging in sport in lots of different ways. Whether that's exercise or being part of a team and so on and so forth. But we know as well that connecting to what you were saying, I suppose that men's sport can also often be entangled with perhaps like hyper ideas of masculinity, right? And things like drinking and violence and misogyny being quite prevalent in some sporting contexts. So I suppose, perhaps it'd be interesting to know, like, what's your experience been like of engaging in sport whilst doing and thinking about these kind of gender equality issues? I mean, do you think that it is possible to create cultures within sport which are actually egalitarian and non-violent and kind of healthy? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my simple, straightforward answer is like, yes, 100% it's possible to do that. And I've been in a whole variety of them. Like, okay, probably I've never been in a single culture anywhere that's perfect and that doesn't require work and that doesn't annoy people at times and make people feel excluded and whatever else. But I've been in lots of places that have been really fantastic. But yeah, like I think there can be, and there often is, problems in some sporting environments, driven by there can there is such a direct linkage there in those spaces between uh, your performance and your value to the group. Like very literally, we quantify who is the best within sports, right? There's a scoring system. There's almost always some way of saying, okay, this person or that group is better than that other group, right? And that form of competition can sometimes degenerate into like that hyper competitiveness, into dominance, into it can excuse things like aggression or bullying as being, oh no, that's just part of trying to pursue that goal, and that's what we're here for. And this space is allowed for that. And I think I mean, you see some of like the sociology of sport kind of like label that as being like, oh, well, that's an outlet for those aspects of our personalities. And I really disagree with that. Like, I don't think necessarily that we need an outlet to kind of let off our aggression and our violence. I think what sport actually does for people is gives them this structure that they enter into, which kind of simplifies what they're doing with their lives and in that moment, and they can focus on an activity, and hopefully they can focus on trying to learn about how they're using their body and work out ways about how they can do it differently, and maybe gradually improve themselves and share that in a playful way with other people, and to have that contribution be recognized and celebrated, whether they're winning or not. And I'm not saying, I actually don't believe everyone should get a participation prize and that should be the most valuable thing. Like I think it can be good to say like, hey, this person has really achieved excellence in this area. But I do think the emphasis that is placed even at the most elite sports in respecting the opponents, in just simple things like shaking people's hands after games, etc., is like a really valuable thing to happen there. And so for us as an organization, we see sports as being like a wonderful place to have interventions and create conversations, because often you're kind of working with people who aren't normally engaged, and you're working in a space where they do really draw a lot of influence on their own personal identity and behaviors, and how they show up elsewhere.
I wanted to ask you something about your writing actually on sport and sport and masculinity, because, you know, prior to working at Beyond Equality, that's what you did, as we said in the introduction. And I think, I mean, your PhD was on the place of Fiji in the international system of rugby union. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, but I think you've also argued that sport has always been an arena where men have enacted masculinity, but since the 1980s, things have shifted and it's become increasingly central in defining masculinity. So why do you say that? What's shifted and in what ways? Or is that too?
Andy, you're putting me.
I mean, I was
putting
thinking,
really on the spot. I gotta.
well, actually, yeah, it's terrible trying to remember some of the things one's written over time.
Yeah,
I have the
precisely.
same problem when someone says that, and I think, hold on, did I write that? But I was thinking about, you know, sort of economic restructuring and pauperization since the 1980s, you know, all of that, the impact of maybe satellite TV, corporate sponsorship, you know, young men not being able to meet provider aspirations and expectations. Those kinds of issues seem to have become much more to the fore, and also kind of playing out in a way in relation to the Men's Football World Cup now in Qatar. You know, you can see some of these things which are there and prominent, and, you know, not addressed as issues around masculinity necessarily. So I wonder if that helps in terms of...
It does. It does. I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, I mean, different timings for different societies around the world, but in lots of ways, and the project I would say that probably most influential in this idea was called Global Sport. And that had researchers from, I know, a whole range of different countries, but predominantly in the Global South, and that was studying the shifts that are happening at the social level to enable large numbers of men in particular, and sometimes women, but to a much lesser extent women, to be pursuing the opportunities or the promise of opportunities in the global north, in the professional sports world. And if you think about it, like what we see, you know, you might see like one of the pro footballers playing for a Premier League club, and they're there and they earn huge salaries, and you're like, okay, well, it's obvious why someone would want to, you know, take that opportunity. But the reality of what's happening in lots of places, both within the global south, but also within certain areas within global north countries, like particularly around communities there that are socioeconomically marginalized, is that there's that the potential of that opportunity is known, and there's not other potential lines of work that can compete with that at all. And so there's a huge social investment and individual investment by far more people than could ever possibly benefit from those global structures, right? And from those global industries of sports. And so what we were interested in, like, yes, is like, what's the experience of that highly successful migrant who moves overseas? But I think what our research was really interested in was like, what's the experience of the people who invest 10 years of their life that have their families providing for them for that entire period of time and don't actually get to go anywhere, never quite get that income coming back? Like, how does everything get restructured to support that? And we're very interested in that social restructuring, because it's as with, if one of the features of the social understanding of what it is to be a man, of masculinity, that's really common around the world, as you said, Sandy, is that provider idea. You know, and you can kind of see this play out in TikTok things about men talking about their lives and how they feel if they don't have a job and what they need to do to show up for their family. There's all of that sort of stuff, but it plays out in so many places in so many ways. There's that very common gender divide between men have to bring in the money, women are looking after the home. You know, it's challenged, it's changed, it's various, but there is that broad trend. And what was getting at in the article that you were talking about, Sandy, was that with a lot of the restructuring that happened, particularly around the period of 1980s, 1990s, driven by some of those, the financial conditions imposed upon countries in order to get funding and grants and finance from the World Bank, the IMF, or institutions like that, was a restructuring of the civil services, a restructuring of industries and things like this to make things more open for global trade and global movement of, and that changed the type of opportunities that were available to people. And what we saw was, as we've seen in the UK, was a lot of those jobs that could have been locally based and are attached to a particular industry. It would be manufacturing jobs or maybe government service jobs. Those things disappeared. And there was less of that sense of security and like, this is what you can actually do with yourself to fulfill that provider role. And what's replaced that idea of a steady job, a long-term job. And here we're talking globally, right? But very much also we're talking about the West and we're talking about the global North, where this is where this is really getting driven from, is the idea that the winner will take all, and if you just work hard and you prove yourself, you can make it for yourself. Like these are these ideas very much with like, late capitalism or with neo-liberalism, which is like, you are your own brand, you are your own entity, build up your skills, build up your qualifications. You have that power to create that future for yourself. And there's wonderful empowerment messages that are tied in with that and are great. But also they fuel this idea that the individual can succeed alone and should succeed alone. And linking back to sports, what we start to see there is the picture of the story of the hero athlete who has got to either is just born with such God-given talents, has been blessed, to use some of the language that might be quite prominent in Fiji, or has also had that support from the family. That's another narrative that's really strong and can drive all that stuff, but had to work hard and got this opportunity, and those talents flourish and they get rewarded and they have that success. And that type of story and storyline, is mirrored in other forms of ideas that we really see getting pushed at the moment all around the world. Like I can see the parallels in the appeal of some of the messages of Andrew Tate, for example, to young men, or of Jordan Peterson to maybe a slightly older group of men, of like, hey, what you're doing here is you're pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You're putting yourself together. You're learning those skills of discipline. You're finding that value that you have, and you will get that reward when you're able to actually reach that pinnacle as a productive member of society who brings in the money, and with that money can then provide for the people around them. So I think that narrative came in really strongly, and it restructured what people expected from work and the opportunities that were available within societies. And with that, it positions opportunities like professional sports as just being, the thing to go to, especially in places where they link in socially with ideas of what it is to be a man. So in Fiji, where I did a lot of my work, there's a really strong linkage there between men as, well, a version of masculinity there is really tied in with men being warriors, men being part of the military, men being able to provide that protector role to society as well. Also, men being people of faith, of Christian faith, being very dedicated to the family, to the church. So, there's a complex picture there, but it enables a particular type of Indigenous Fijian man to live up and try to attain that form of work and outcome for themselves, and with that, be still the whole way along that process, have their work and that sacrifice of their family and the sacrifice of them validated by society and supported by society, because it still fits in with this model of what you should be doing, especially the more and more it becomes an industry where, at the top are people who own stuff and they take money off and they're billionaires and everything else. Anyway, that's my little rant.
Well, that's so fascinating. I mean, I'm sure we could spend the whole podcast just exploring all the issues that you've laid out there, and the links between masculinity and neoliberalism and sport and so on and so forth, and also that piece that you were just saying about the sort of individualism of it all, the individual responsibility and narrative and story and how that's marketed. But we thought we should also spend some time talking about your organisation, Dan, because otherwise we won't get to it. But so let's talk a little bit about what Beyond Equality does, and how was it that Beyond Equality, or I think Good Lad, as it was originally named, started off in the first place. How would you say the organisation has developed over time and shifted over time, and what's your vision for it moving forward?
Yeah. I think I gave a pretty good intro to the moment that it started, which was kind of boiling out of those, that recognition that men really need to be involved in these conversations, because, men like me and the people around were part of causing harm to other people, and we weren't getting involved, and we didn't think it was about us. So there just seemed to be like a missing link there. And I was providing that link so that men would talk about where sexual violence comes from and how it's related to how they behave around each other and the sort of things that we value and encourage. How's it related to the way we brag about how many people we've hooked up with, the way that we lie about that to each other, or we feel a sense of like failure or insecurity if we haven't. So those sorts of links was why it started. And actually, so it started there at university running workshops, and they're quite short, they're quite sharp. They're probably a bit more like hit the issue on the head and then deal with like, actually, here's the truth, boom. All right, let's deal with the fallout, and all right, you're out, go and do it. And there was also a separate project that started in schools at the same time, and the similar bridge, like it was from two women who saw that every conference they went to on any of these sorts of issues, it was all women, or maybe there would be a few men, normally men who were queer, and they would be like, well, where are the straight men? Where are the cis men in this? Why don't they show up for anything on sexual violence or gender equality or anything? So they kind of like try to bridge that by offering training to men who wanted to make an impact with boys, and create a better version of masculinity for those boys. I think where it's ended up now is that the conversations that we have are far less issue based, and the pedagogically, like from the outset, the idea was you've got to get social norms to the surface so people can understand them and understand how they're impacting upon their own behaviors. Right? And I think now we just give ourselves more time and space to actually do that and to focus on that as an outcome of helping people talk to each other about what's going on for them and bringing that up. And as it's progressed, it's meant that we, I think we go a little bit deeper into conversations rather than just talk about the symptoms of an issue. We really try to get to what are the social drivers that are happening here, and how do those social drivers actually feel for you? And from that sort of a conversation, you open up a lot more vulnerability, and then use that vulnerability to reach some empathy for other people. And then through that, you can see what the shared liberation would be. I'm throwing lots of jargon out here, but the shared liberation would be if you could dismantle some of those drivers and dismantle that stuff that sits beneath, and then engage people in that collective project of doing it in that little pocket of people that they're with at the time. So
presumably,
yeah.
I was just going to say, well, doing that kind of work in that way, it sounds like you need to go quite deep, and therefore, you need time to do that. You need skilled facilitation to do that. I'm just wondering how you balance that with, going in and running workshops in, say, a school or a university, on a sort of tight schedule.
Super tight schedule.
Quite hard to do.
Yeah, really hard to do. Yeah, and I think that there was two things you brought in. It was like the skill of the facilitator and then the time. And I think more and more we are shifting towards having like a much higher skilled group of facilitators. Now, if any of the original volunteers and whoever else are listening, like not having a go at the quality of people in the past, but more if you've got people who are having these conversations 2 or 3 times a week, and do that for several years, you can start to recognize where the threads are, that if you pull at them a little bit, the thing will come undone, or actually lead to the place. And what are the bits where what are the conversations where they're just going to go around in circle and people are not going to really, get anywhere. So there's a skill in recognizing that, and also in reading the room and reading, when is there a blockage here? Because actually there's a group of people who are angry and we've got to talk about that first. Or, feel victimized, and we've got to spend 20 minutes on that, which takes us way off the lesson plan, but 20 minutes on being like, okay, let's talk about why you feel victimized and where does that come from? What does it feel like? And okay, and let's validate some of those feelings as well. Because there's no point saying like your feelings are wrong. But then taking the next level, having allowed people know that their feelings are going to be okay in that space, even if they're like politically incorrect or, not woke or whatever else. It's like, okay, but now we can have a conversation about why you feel like that, and maybe about how some of the assumptions of what you're hearing or assumptions of the way you think the world's working aren't based in reality. They're based in, you've been sold I was going to say like an untruth. I don't know. You've been sold lies by some commentators who say that feminism is an attack on men and feminism is an attack on you. And so that might be like a false assumption that leads to that feeling of anger or frustration or victimization. Or maybe there's just like a misconception of like actually what people's experiences are. And you say, well, no, like the reality is that not many women do make up assaults and false accusations. They're not. It's actually a really, really low percentage of that. It happens, but not very often, and not compared to the amount of stories that don't get told. So yeah, but we would love to be in places more. We would love to have more funding to do that. It's a challenge. I think we've made the decision. Currently, most of the impact we try to make, we try to have the most difficult conversations with our most skilled facilitators. Then we try to equip some people in that space to have to a high enough level that they can carry some conversations on. So there might be other student leaders, or they might be teachers, or whoever it might be, like youth workers, so they can keep some of the conversations going. And then we try to provide more, I guess, like not necessarily entry-level resources, but resources that individuals who are already engaged can start to do the work more themselves. And podcasts like this would be a part of that, and all sorts of other things where people who are like, oh, hold on, this was interesting, I'm going to go along for the ride for a little bit more. But I think for us, we don't believe that we can completely effectively get to the surface some of those deeply held misconceptions or those deeply ingrained stereotypes, so that people can look at them and unpack them without having someone in the room who's really skilled at doing that work. Right. And so for us, where it limits the modes in which we can expand our work, but it's where we're trying to do. So we're trying to recruit locally based people and give them some quite in-depth training and support and a lot of co-facilitation, so that they can then start taking those conversations forward in like a really high quality way.
So interesting how your practice has developed over time then. I wasn't really aware of that, but that's really fascinating. And I guess you must be trying to do some sort of monitoring and evaluation of the shift that's going on within the organisation. Are you doing that, and how are you doing that?
Yeah. Monitoring and evaluation is not easy with a lot of these
No.
things. What we end up doing all the time is some post workshop monitoring data where we get the participants to feed back into their perceptions of whether they have taken the steps that we see as being important along the process of change. But then on top of that, what we do whenever possible is we do pre and post surveys with the participants, like say 3 months afterwards. So beforehand, you survey, afterwards, get a baseline. And then I think really wonderful work we do occasionally, which is some case studies where we go to a place and talk to some of both the young people who've done the workshops and see like, what did you get from them? What are you thinking about? But then also in our case, we'll talk to a lot of the girls and non-binary people who didn't do the workshops and say, well, what's going on for you? Like, have the boys actually changed? What's coming up? What are still issues that you face? And some of the data we got from that, I think, is like really positive about what we do. And like, yeah, it's straight. Like they came out and they were the girls were surprised by how much the boys had talked about and stuff. Sometimes it's like identifying that, well, once they identified that we have to change one of the activities we do because it was having some negative impacts that we weren't picking up on otherwise. So specifically, it meant that boys were then very openly having conversations around the links between porn and their behaviors, but in ways which were actually really objectifying and really difficult for the girls to listen to. And it was like, okay, we need to change the activity that brought that stuff to the surface, because we can't have the boys leaving the room and doing stuff that the girls in their class are getting harmed by. So that like we had to shift, and sometimes it brought up stuff which was of more broad interest, like the problem isn't actually the boys in the school. The problem is the male teachers, and the problem is that or a few male teachers who play into those stereotypes, even sexualize the teenage girls for the sake of winning over the boys at the back of the classroom who are a bit hard to manage. So make a comment about, oh wow, there's a lot of short skirts here today, or something like this, and the boys kind of giggle and the girls feel mortified and drop out of that particular class. So some of those findings are, well, deeply disturbing, I think, as an adult who works with young people. Sadly, maybe not completely surprising, but still disturbing. And then showing that there needs to be a bigger conversation happening at some of these places, and really like a whole school approach. And one of the great things that's happening at the moment is there's been a shift in the UK in the conversation around, particularly around sexual violence and violence against women and girls, to being, this is men's violence, and it needs to get tackled by addressing social norms. And there's a real appetite for, I'll put it another way, whereas probably 5 years ago, the 5 teachers in the school who wanted this stuff to happen would have been met with 1,000 reasons why it couldn't, and why there wasn't money for it, and why it was going to cause more problems than it was going to solve. Now their arguments are cutting through, and they can actually get some stuff done.
Yeah, because I can imagine that participating in your workshops must be really impactful for a lot of the boys and men and people that do get to take part in them. But as we know, like one of the big challenges in this field, I suppose, is that question of how to scale it up, isn't it? That obviously that's great for all those who are taking part, but the issue is so huge. We need to be getting it out there to so many more people. So yeah, what are you doing around that? I mean, do you have plans in the pipeline? I believe you've got a project with Movember which is being developed. Do you want to say anything about future kind of opportunities and movements?
Yeah, fantastic. We're in particular really excited by the Movember project, which we were awarded a very large for us chunk of funding, maybe not large for some other organizations, but very large for us chunk of funding as part of their Scaling What Works project. So we had to prove to them that what we're doing is working and having an impact. and then they're helping us take those conversations to 20 groups of men in each of 11 different places across the UK. But the wonderful thing about this for us is that they're actually paying to start with for us to recruit and train facilitators who are locally based, and then to do the work of adapting any materials we need to local context so that we can actually implement these projects. And the particular work we'll be doing is around getting those groups of men to understand how they can be supporting each other and how we can actually address these problems of like social isolation, mental well-being, mental health, not as an individual issue, not as something that's like needs to be medicalized all the time, but that it can also be dealt with collectively and preventatively by unpacking those social norms, doing some of this gender transformative work. That means that the conversation is not only about, it's okay to seek help in theory, but it's also about individual men recognizing like, yeah, we probably as a group, we're like, yeah, if you need help, just come to me, mate, no problems. Yeah, I'll have a yarn, we'll have a beer, we'll address we'll find a way to deal with your problem. But actually to say, in reality, they as individuals don't seek that help from each other because they fear losing something by asking for help. And what do they feel like they're going to lose? They feel like they're going to be emasculated. They feel like they're going to lose that sense of being in control, of being able to deal with problems, which has been drummed into them from the start as being like the foundational, or the entry requirement into this group that we call men. And that's why it's called gender transformative work. What it actually means is just like, before we can get men to buy into those mental well-being programs or violence prevention or whatever else we want to do, we need to help them understand how they are feeling pressured into going along with certain expectations in the way that it's limiting their behaviors. And that's where we start. And we start that in a group, and we give that group the opportunity to create a new set of norms and to actually slowly but surely reward each other for coming forward and sharing stuff they're going through and asking for help. It's like slowly but steadily but surely passing those burdens onto the collective rather than dealing with it as an individual. So that's the vision, and we're really excited about that. And we're trying to build on top of that like a sustainable organization that can actually be doing all of our projects, so not just the Movember project, but also the schools project and workplaces work. The other direction the other part of this plan really needs to be joining in with the work that people like you are doing and lots of other people in our sector, of getting these issues onto the agenda in the first place. So that when someone sees that poster, they have enough of that initial recognition that they know that, oh, this is a fantastic opportunity that will feel good for me and for my team, rather than being like, this looks like, wishy-washiness, or this looks like an attack on men and therefore an attack on me. So there's creating those spaces for that public discussion, which involves, potentially putting together some big events to get men who are interested to come and talk and share. It involves some work with some celebrities. And what we want to do is, rather than have them be spokespeople from day one, have them host private conversations in their own sectors. Because I think probably one of the biggest barriers that we face is that men, if they want to take that step to talk to their friend, and for example, we've got this at the moment, a 16 days of action challenge. And last year, what we did for it, a global thing, global campaign, not by us. We're a very tiny part of it. I'm sure your listeners already know this, but 16 days of action against gender-based violence. And we're running a thing where we give people daily reflections and readings and whatever else and prompts so that they can build up, so that at the end they can take an action. And that's really fantastic. And last year, the journey went pretty well, but the final action, we said, what you have to do is get 5 of your mates to come down to the pub and have a conversation, or to a cup of tea, or whatever is appropriate for what you and your mates do. A Zoom call, if you're in lockdown. 5 people. And the feedback was it actually felt really awkward to place myself in that position as being the spokesperson for what's right or what's good, or and people are like, I'm worried that I'm being a hypocrite here because I've now done the reflection to know that I've done all these things that are, and I keep on falling into stuff that actually reproduces some of this harm. I'm like, they're going to laugh at this and laugh at me, and I think there's that little thing of actually giving people the confidence that it's important to talk about these issues, even if they're not a world-leading expert, is a really important piece of work to do, because none of this is going to change unless we can talk about each of those moments that these harmful ideas show up, and each of those instances, and actually like call each other in at that point and help people to do things just that tiny little bit differently, so that we can change things for the better.
Wow, that sounds amazing, and yeah, really great work, and also the work with Movember as well. I think making the links between mental health and how actually that does connect to the drivers of violence against women as well, for example. But as you mentioned, I mean, the last question I had was, we are recording this during the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and as you mentioned earlier, we have seen quite a big upsurge in conversations about this, about masculinity and what it has to do with different forms of violence in the last few years, especially as a result of feminist campaigns and movements like Me Too, like after the murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, for example. So I was just wondering, how has this impacted on your work, and where do you think we're at in the UK now with these conversations? And I suppose, I mean, do you think there's been enough of a response from policymakers? What kind of response would you like to see at the kind of political level to help support the kind of change which you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a huge impact here, and there was each time there is one of these these campaigns, these moments of women crying out for change and for justice and for just to get it left alone and be safe and have dignity, right? Some pretty basic stuff. So many men are then activated, and each time we just see a massive spike in the people who contact us and say, I would like to volunteer. I want to be involved. I want to be the person who's in there talking to 15-year-olds, and I can change this stuff. And it's really fantastic that energy comes to the surface. It drops off pretty quickly, I would say. When daily life starts to happen, it's like, well, that's always a problem. We know it's always a problem. So, I've got other problems as well. That makes sense. I think the other thing that happens is there's also a spike of people who hear something very different, and actually we get that polarization from these moments of public outcry. And I think a big part of our work is trying to catch those people who are going down the other end, who hear Me Too, who hear everyone is invited, who hear who hear the public discourse about it's men's violence and are like #NotAllMen, is to try to capture some of them and just translate the messages across so that they hear the truth of what people are saying with their experiences, and they can hear the change that people are calling for, and they can understand themselves as having a role in that, and because they do, we need the men who are writing #NotAllMen. We need them to know that we're not saying you can't be part of this future. We want you to be part of this future, but we want the future to be one that's safe and equitable, and there's stuff that you can do there. So for me, often it's and I would say this is leading to the policy question. I appreciate and understand policies and changes, and a lot of other things that shift towards prevention. So shifting towards what are we doing in the future. So I think when there's the knee-jerk reaction to further police things and bolster that, and I think that's a often harmful response to these sorts of issues, and the focus needs to be on prevention, and it needs to be on long-term sustainable change, and it needs to be on restorative justice and opening up conversations. So that's for me where policy attention should go and resources should go.
Sounds like there's a tremendous lot to be involved in there. So thanks for talking to us, Dan. I really appreciate, particularly, earlier in our conversation, your honesty about your own history and narrative and, what you've experienced. That was very, very powerful. And also, your so thoughtful sort of contributions about the development of the organisation, where you're going. I mean, it all sounds really, really very impressive. So thanks for talking to us today. And I hope our Christmas gift to you could be getting a few more men involved, because it sounds like you need some as well.
Yeah, for sure. The more the merrier. So thank you so much for having me on board, and for asking me the questions, and for tolerating me going on those rambles, monologues for 5-10 minutes at a time. So it's been nice talking.
It's been great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and good luck with all the brilliant work you're doing.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a really enthralling conversation with Dan, wasn't it, Sandy? I mean, it's so fascinating to kind of trace the trajectory of his life and his career, really. I mean, that personal story he had, which he shared, was really powerful, actually, to learn about the journey which he himself has been through, and then how he's kind of worked on these issues in academia, and really kind of highlighted how these major global economic forces are actually tied in with issues of gender and masculinity, and how these things are interacting and influencing each other. And then how we talked about the work that Beyond Equality are doing now, which sounds really exciting. But it seemed to me there was one of the common threads there, which was very powerful in terms of his own personal story, was about how so often perhaps we as men don't ask for help, whether that is if we're really struggling with some kind of health issue, or whether it is because we're really struggling with something in our minds and our mental health, or whether that's because we think that we should have the answers, but we actually don't feel confident always to know what to do. For example, about the issue of violence against women, perhaps there's a lot of men who just don't quite know what their role should be, or what they should be doing or saying about it, but they don't feel like they have the confidence, or that they're allowed to kind of ask for help about how to deal with that, really. What did you make of the conversation?
Well, just building on the point you made there, really, Stephen. When Dan was talking about his own story, and I mean, I did say in the conversation, I felt he was pretty honest, and he was pretty brave to talk about this stuff, but it's important that he did. He made me think, when he was talking about the surgery he had, about a book called Unmasking Masculinity by fairly well-known sociologist David Jackson. This was a book from, I think, the 1990s. And at one point, David has surgery. I think he may have had a heart attack. And the point is that he uses that moment in order to reflect on where he's got to in his life and what he wants to do with his life, and actually I think that can be a common story where men at certain points, being a father or having an illness or whatever, can shift in terms of how they want to be a man. So I thought that was interesting. Effectively it's a sort of critical autobiography from a masculinity's point of view, and I just think it's a great book. So I really recommend it if people are interested in this sort of area about life history and masculinity.
Yeah, because I thought the story he was telling shows how this is an ongoing process and a journey, right, for any man who does get involved in this work. But at the same time, there can be those pivotal moments where perhaps you have a new insight, or a kind of a grasp of your own vulnerability, or just a new perspective, which can kind of cause a big shift in your life, really. Did you have any other thoughts about what Dan said?
Well, one of the other things that I thought was interesting was about not only how young men react to the work that Beyond Equality does, which he did discuss quite a bit, but also how the institutions respond too, because that seems to me to be a critical part of this. I mean, he did say, we need to have whole school approaches, and I think I agree with that, really. And given the way he described the sort of pathway that the work has followed, there must be some questions in there for the institutions, be it, a school, a university, a sports club, whatever. So, how do we make space in our curriculum or our activities to allow for the kind of in-depth conversations that Beyond Equality want to have? How do they allow for that? How do they allocate the time? How do they devote resources to that when there's so much else that they're trying to do at the same time? And also, I think that, there is a key point there, particularly in schools, about training some of the teachers perhaps as well. So some of the work is not just directly with boys and young men. It may be with those people who have influence over them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they have the ability to actually break down some of the kind of defensiveness which might come both from individuals and also from organizations at times about why they should be engaging with these issues. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like that actually connects to what he was saying about sport and rugby and football and the kind of impact of like neoliberal ideas about the individual and that we as individuals should we should have all this agency and power over our own lives and to achieve whatever it is that we want to achieve and which society tells us we should strive to achieve. Because maybe sometimes there's a risk that we fall into that trap even in this space, isn't there? That we put all the emphasis on what individual men need to do to change themselves and the wider society, but actually like we only have so much agency in that regard, don't we? And actually we do need to think much more broadly about how institutions and different layers of society have to shift and change as well. So I think that's such an interesting connection, and I do think that face-to-face work they're doing with individuals is really powerful, but clearly I think it's great as well that they're thinking more broadly about how to shift those wider cultures, I guess, as well.
The link with Movember I found was interesting too. I mean, that sounds like a really fascinating project that they're developing there. Oh, incidentally, for listeners' benefit, Dan had a full beard, but I don't think he's managed to grow that in November this time. But if he has, I'm even more impressed, I have to say.
Yeah, there's a lot going on at the moment, isn't there? Because it also made me think about, obviously we do have the Football World Cup going on at the moment in Qatar, the men's World Cup. Which I suppose just highlights a lot of the issues he was talking about. And I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about sport. How sport can actually be quite a positive experience, like depending on the kind of culture which is nurtured within it, really. But I think we can see, unfortunately, that within Qatar and the men's football world currently, there's so many issues, and maybe it's not doing anywhere near as much as it could be to actually think about issues of sexism and gender inequality, as we talked about on a previous episode with Stacey Pope. So it feels like a real contrast to the Women's European Championships, which we had earlier this year, where, of course, the England team were eventually successful. So I just wonder if that's causing some reflection among some men who are fans of football as well, actually, that actually are they still enjoying this sport or not, and perhaps maybe leading more to actually enjoy watching women's football, for example, and what impact does that then have on their perspectives and their attitudes, both to sport and also to gender and society more broadly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's only a minor thing, but I don't know if you noticed yesterday that for the first time, the referee and linesman, or should I say linespeople, at one of the matches were all women. And this was a great sort of to-do and a marvellous innovation, which it is. But at the same time, there's so much more that needs to be done, and without going into all the sort of politics around Qatar and human rights and LGBT issues, but little by little, there are some things that are changing in a positive way, I guess one can say.
Yeah, no, and I had mixed feelings about that, because on the one hand, I think that is great, but on the other hand, like, is it a bit tokenistic when essentially all the people with power making all these terrible decisions and often being quite corrupt and stuff are still, men from Western countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the points, the research that Dan did many years ago now on, the impact of corporate sponsorship, satellite TV, powerful men in the industry, etc. And that's all still hugely relevant, isn't it? And so
that's
much more
what's influencing so much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, perhaps we should stop there for this time. But thank you so much, everybody, as always, for listening. And yeah, do subscribe to Now and Men if you haven't already. Don't hesitate to send us an email at nowandmen@gmail.com if you have comments or questions. We'll also put a link in the show notes to the social media and website of Beyond Equality. And hopefully we'll be speaking to you again with another episode soon.
Cheerio, mate.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.